I can say with certainty that is the last time my name is going to be on the same marquee as your names. Also not a Nobel Prize winner, just in case. That's me. So this is called 7 Days of Genius. And when the word genius was mentioned, I was backstage with all of you guys, and there was a lot of eye rolling and chuckling. But like it or not, you are considered geniuses, so take it. I want to start with a broad question, because you are considered geniuses of the field, in the field of economics. This is sort of a philosophical question as much as it is anything else. You're considered geniuses, but when we talk about the most disruptive thing that happened, economically speaking, globally, we talk about the years 2007 and 2008. And yet many economists failed to predict that disruptive moment in the United States and globally.
But both Paul and I did.
Yes, I'm talking, and that's why you're the geniuses. and I guess, and to that point, I wonder if you think the field of economics, on whole, is better at reinterpreting the events of the past than it is looking towards the future. I'll start with you,
Yeah,
Paul.
so no, I didn't predict it. I mean, I thought something bad would happen, but nothing remotely on this scale, right? So the housing bubble, thought it would be ugly, but the scale of the ugliness came as a shock to me, as to almost everyone. But I actually think, let me say that the crisis itself, the financial crisis, we didn't, hardly, some people saw it coming, but they also saw 5 crises that didn't happen coming, so it doesn't quite count. But in a way, that is to some extent excusable, because the world is a complicated place. There's always going to be something out there that you missed, and that's typically where really drastic events come from. What's not much known is that actually since those crisis days, a lot of basic economics has worked remarkably well. I mean, I didn't see the crisis coming, but I and many others said, look, all these people telling you that the Fed's printing money is going to cause runaway inflation, that interest rates are going to soar because of those budget deficits. Not so. Look at the situation we're in. It's not going to work. And in fact, it's worked beautifully. One of the things I sometimes say is I've spent my life not entirely sure whether I was a fraud or not, because I knew I was good at publishing papers.
I think the jury's in on that one.
No, but that was interesting. I was only in the last 6 or so years that I'd say, oh, hey, the stuff works. We've been actually pretty good on a lot of these issues these past years. So that's actually, now, the sad thing is that half the economics profession has thrown away things that we know work largely for ideological reasons. So the real sin, from my point of view, is not the failure to predict the crisis, it's the insistence on clinging to doctrines that are just obviously not working for the 6 years that have followed the crisis.
Professor Stiglitz?
Well, I think in terms of that, I think one of the things is that I think the economy's recovery has not been particularly good, and that I think it was pretty clear that you could not just rely on monetary policy.
Right.
That it helped a little bit. I think Paul was right that the fears that all that increase printing of money, whatever you call it, would be inflationary were absurd, and that's been proven right. But also it's true that there were economists who thought that monetary policy would do the trick.
Right.
And who thought that, the way I put it, that putting the banks in the hospital for a year and a half, giving them not a blood transfusion, but a couple $1 trillion of money, would make them feel happier, and that would get the economy working again. It's clear that that was wrong, that you needed real fiscal policy, you needed real stimulus, and that in a fundamental sense, the economy was broken before the crisis. It was using a bubble to keep it going. And that's what we should have recognized and was not by most members of the economics profession and by the administration.
Well, let me first apologize that my English sounds a lot like French, and let me also mention that it's 2 a.m. in Paris, and so if I seem a bit slow, there are reasons for this. But I think there's a lot of ideology in the economic profession, and I think many economists have a view of markets which is not only idealistic and naive, but they are defending the view that markets are working efficiently, are working well, for ideological reason. Also, I think economists spend a lot of time, sometimes doing complicated mathematical models, trying to pretend that markets are efficient. But they do that also to try to impress others in other disciplines to look more scientific. I am not sure.
No, this is not a joke.
I am not sure this is. I'm not sure this is working, but this is certainly part of their strategy. So, I think we should be very modest. I view myself more as a social scientist than as an economist. I think the frontiers between economics, history, sociology are not as clear as what economists try to pretend. Economists try to pretend that sometimes they have developed a science that is so sophisticated that the rest of the world cannot understand, but I think this is a joke. I think the reason I was attracted in this field is because I think we start from very low, from very little, so at least there is room to make progress, but we have to recognize that all we can do. I don't believe in genius. I think our only advantage as compared to other people is that we are paid to collect data and to try to understand the theoretical mechanism or models that can account for this data. And we have to be modest and try to make this little progress if we want to be useful. And it's not always clear that economists are so useful.
We put too much stock in economists, perhaps. But let me ask you, as someone who's observing society holistically, perhaps not discretely mathematically, in terms of your social scientist cap, Europe. And I'll ask you guys this vis-a-vis America. Where do you see Europe in 20 years, given the sort of upheaval that the EU is facing at this moment?
Okay, well, that's a difficult question. Right now, the situation in Europe, and particularly in the Eurozone, is very bad. So the main problem with inequality today in Europe is really unemployment, youth unemployment. So the level of youth unemployment, in Southern Europe, but also in France, is extremely large. So when you have, 20%, sometimes 25, 30% of the young generation who start their life with no professional experience, this is a terrible situation. And I think the basic problem is that the Eurozone is not working. I think it's possible to make it work, but a single currency with 18 different public debt, 18 different interest rates on which financial markets can speculate, 18 different tax systems in competition with one another. This is a system that does not work and that will.
So do you think the Eurozone is untenable?
No, I think what we need, you cannot have a single currency without a government. So what I think we will need is a Eurozone parliament that will vote a budget, that will have, for instance, a common corporate tax. There was a recent scandal in Europe with the so-called Luxembourg leaks scandal, where many international multinational corporations from the US, but also from Europe, appeared to be paying almost no corporate tax at all by putting their accounts basically in Luxembourg. And so we had Jean-Claude Juncker, who is president of the European Commission, who came to the European media and said, well, this was not my fault. I was at the head of Luxembourg, and I had to find a development strategy for my country, and there was disindustrialization, so I had to find something else. And my idea was to become a tax haven, basically to take.
Yes.
And this was amazing, because every country in Europe has a problem with disindustrialization, and so if we all just steal the tax base of each other, we are not going to go very far. And so I think here, as long as we have unanimity rule to decide for taxation, and in particular corporate taxation, in Europe, we will be in this situation where we reduce the tax burden on large corporations, high income, high wealth individuals, and we overtax low-skilled labor, medium-skilled labor that cannot move, and that's bad for job creation, that's bad for unemployment, and that's part of the reason. So, I think there are ways to fix this, but with the current European institutions, which are based on unanimity rule for fiscal decision and which are based on automatic rules for deficit reduction with too much austerity. There was an attempt to reduce the public deficit that was too fast and that has killed growth. So we need a more democratic governance of Europe, and I think it's important that France and Italy do not just complain about Germany all the time, which is one of the and make concrete proposals to change the European treaties and the European institutions. And if we do that, then in 20 years maybe Europe will be in a good situation. Otherwise, I'm not so optimistic if we don't change the existing European institutions.
So I would pose that question. I mean, and obviously feel free to weigh in on Europe to the degree that you want to, but where do you see the United States in 20 years, or what do you see in the next 20 years?
Well, first let me say, I'm in general, like most economists, fairly pessimistic about the world. And the only thing that makes me feel good about America is that things could be worse. and when...
Well, there's an old line along those lines that said, a voice came to me and said, cheer up, things could be worse. So I cheered up, and sure enough, things got worse. Anyway.
Sliding scale of expectations,
So this is not just, we're talking where we're going, say, on the issue of inequality. This is not just like the issues in Europe, are not just economic issues. I mean, I think if we were running Europe, we would know how to get it out of its troubles. We would know what policies and what changes in the structure would be required. And the same thing, if it were left to Paul and me, I think, in the United States, I think we would be able to, reduce the level of inequality.
We're not geniuses, we're philosopher kings.
Yeah.
Anyway, no. Anyway.
So I think we could. The real question is you're asking a little bit about a political crystal ball. And economist crystal ball, as you point out, was very cloudy, and a political crystal ball is really, really cloudy. But what I say is that if we don't change some of the fundamental policies that we've had in place and the way, I could see our inequality getting much worse in the United States.
Well, and Paul, you write about the political system as well.
Yeah.
I mean, given what we have right now and the trend lines we see with bifurcation and a partisan split.
Yeah, I mean, so my version of what Joe was going to say is I say, it's been kind of a race between us and Europe to see who can screw up worse. And at the moment, Europe is winning, but it's but not by. And actually, one thing I want to say is I think that the European problem, there is a huge structural problem, which is that you have a single currency without a single government, and that is a fundamental thing. But there are also, it's exacerbated by bad economic doctrines, and it's exacerbated by there's a lot of what I'm making this up on the spot, fiscal hypochondria in Europe. There's this tendency to assume that you're broke and you're busted and you're failing even when you aren't. Case in point being France. Here we have a government that thinks it has a deficit crisis, thinks it has a debt crisis, thinks that its economy is failing. It can borrow 10-year at 0.6% interest rates. That doesn't look like a fiscal crisis. If you look at the employment record, it's actually not bad. If you actually look at prime age workers, if you're a person in that 25 to 55 age range, you're more likely to be employed in France than you are in the United States. So you have this, and yet the French have managed to become convinced that they're in this desperate strait, and they do things that make it worse. So
Aren't we here to convince? I mean,
well,
the narrative goes on in certain sectors of our political discourse that things are terrible and we've been run off the rails.
Oh, the Bolo Simpsonism was our version of it, but the fact of the matter is we at least had some significant pushback on that, and it didn't go so far. What I would say about America is we have a lot of advantages. I mean, the American society is flexible, it's accommodating. We get tremendous ability to accept talent from around the world, just a general level of I think, of intellectual flexibility in many ways. And then we have half of our political system is stark raving mad. And because
Not saying which side, which half.
right, yeah, because as a Times columnist, I can't do endorsements. You have no idea who I support. And because of our constitutional structure, it's actually possible for that, even in the best of circumstances, that effectively blockades lots of action. You know, God help us if the financial crisis struck again. Try to imagine, you know, putting together even the very flawed rescue of the financial system and all of that. What would we do now? If things went really wrong, you know, we'd have people saying that the solution is to close the border with Mexico or something. I mean, it would just be...
They may still say that yet.
Yeah.
But can I just pick up on one point, which is one of the problems is focusing on the wrong problem. So that in the case of the United States, we focused on too much debt, and that's also been a problem in Europe. The real problem is that the fruits of our growth have not been widely shared. So if you look at the middle, median income is lower in the United States than it was 25 years ago. Median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. Those are real problems. And unfortunately, that's not where the discourse is.
Well, and that gets us to another sort of other mitigating factors here. I mean, the reason there's a sort of misguided focus on the debt has to do with one of the political parties being obsessively focused on that. It has to do with a media structure that talks about that incessantly. It has to do with folks that just want to hear what they want to hear in one sector. And I guess I wonder, you know, as we look onto the 21st century landscape where facts have become fungible, as economists, how distressing is that to you? I mean, there are true debates about things we thought were settled.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it really, you know, it really is much. This is one of the questions. Wasn't it always thus? And I think it wasn't. It used to be that there was an establishment, and it would sort of settle on what a fact was, and sometimes wrongly, but at least there was, and it was persuadable because it was not that polarized. And now, sure, people know what they know, and they have. I mean, it's a funny thing because the availability of information is greater than ever before. It's possible if you want to learn about a subject and are willing to put in some effort and you know have a little bit of a trying to find out a way to well, if you have just a bit of a bullshit detector, you can screen things out but on the other hand, the ability to live in a cocoon of false stuff. I mean, I've been following, some people I know have been following on healthcare. If you look at the Affordable Care Act and how it's played out, if you have been watching Fox, every problem or rumor of a problem gets reported, and then when it goes away or it turns out it wasn't true, that never gets reported. So you have the feeling that this thing is a disaster. In fact, what we probably have done at this point is we probably insured about 20 million people once the second year stuff, you know, and costs are well below. And so it's actually this great policy success, and half the country thinks it's been a disastrous failure.
Do the French just have better bullshit detectors? I mean, when you hear this,
Well, you know, let me give you an outside viewpoint on inequality in the US. You know, I think I find it, from the outside, you know, it's very difficult to understand why a plan like the one President Obama described a few weeks ago is you know, apparently will never be adopted in the US. You know, the view that you should ask a little more to the top groups that have done so well in recent decades in order to invest in the public education system, and in particular in you know, for all those groups in the population who of course don't go to Harvard or to Princeton and who you know, are accessing a quality of higher education in community college in this country which is not, let's say, as good as it should be. And if you compare how much is invested, you know, there are statistics that are really striking in this country, and which are very difficult to understand from the viewpoint of the rest of the world. Another example, you know, apart from investment in education, you know, you take the level of the minimum wage in this country, is less than what it was in the late 1960s, 50 years ago. So now it's $7.3 or $4 at the federal level per hour. It was $10 if you put it in dollars of today in the late 1960s. So that's quite unusual, in half a century, that a country has a lower minimum wage than what it used to have. And unemployment at that time...
Unusual is euphemistic.
Unemployment at that time was actually the same as today, or less than what it is today. So there was no more unemployment. So, and that's, when you look at it from the rest of the world, that's difficult to understand. So I don't know. In Europe, the problems that people are trying to solve are, in a way, more complicated, because making all nation states, disappear in a peaceful manner and create a new, bigger political community, that's a complicated exercise, which it's not working well, but that's a complicated exercise. I mean, here, in principle, the federal institutions exist, but they don't seem to be responding.
They don't seem to be functioning.
They don't seem to be functioning, and so I've not understood everything as to why the majority rule had become a super majority rule, and I think the rest of the world is not understanding what's happening here in this country. But
you bring up a very good point about the minimum wage, and Walmart just raised its workers' wages. They're going to go up to $10 an hour at some point in the near future. And I wonder, when you guys hear about that, or states taking the initiative to raise the minimum wage, is that the new model? Are we sort of done? Could we be done with the federal minimum wage?
Well, no, I mean, first, let me say, one of the things that Walmart raising their wage to that level illustrates is the fact that it's not just market forces that are determining wages, that they had the power, the choice to raise their wages. Right. And so, in a way, it strengthens the argument that I've had, and I think all of us here have had, that there are a lot of non-market forces determining what is going on. So, it's the same thing. You can't justify, you're talking about the wage at the bottom. You talk about the CEO pay, which has gone from being 30 times the average of the people who are working for them to over 300 times. Without any justification, you can't say they suddenly got more productive. Their productivity increased 10 times faster than the rest of society. So, and what's interesting, and it highlights the political nature, in Dodd-Frank in 2010, there was included a provision that companies would have to disclose this number. And they've been fighting, the corporation's been fighting this disclosure. So we're 2015, 5 years after Dodd-Frank, and the SEC, who's supposed to write the regulations for the disclosure, is still hamstrung. So we got it through, and it got through Congress, got signed, and then the politics has made it impossible to actually get it.
And indeed, provisions of Dodd-Frank are being rolled back.
And then there are provisions that are being rolled back, like the one on the derivatives.
But I want to say a word about local action. So it's an interesting thing. As it turns out, there's a lot more scope for local increases in the minimum wage than you might have expected. I mean, there's actually the evidence we have is overwhelmingly economists who've studied what happens when New Jersey raises its minimum wage and Pennsylvania doesn't, and you would think there would have to be some loss of jobs, and we don't see it, which is telling you there's more room. On the other hand, it's got to be clear on that and everything else that it's a lot better if everybody does it at once. There is presumably some payoff to an individual state from undercutting the wages of every other state, and yet that's counterproductive for society as a whole. So local action is not a substitute for federal action. However, it can be a stepping stone, and I guess I still hope for political redemption. And I'm a big reader of the history of the New Deal, and the history of the New Deal actually begins a long ways before the New Deal. It begins with New Deal type programs at the state level. FDR didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of being governor of New York. He came out of Al Smith's New York. So that when we see these local initiatives that are spreading, they are good things in themselves, but they're also if you want the optimistic story about what America is like 20 years from now, I think a lot of it involves things that start at the level of states and cities trying to do better by their workers, trying to do better by ordinary families, and that eventually becomes the national norm.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I mean, that's the optimistic note. One of the striking things is when they do polls, that about 70%.
That was the optimistic note, and.
They do polls. 70% of Americans believe there ought to be an increase of the minimum wage.
The majority of Republicans believe we should do it.
And
I mean, I think that's part of the, and I would love to get your thoughts on this. There are issues upon which the vast majority of Americans agree, and our political system has proven incapable of moving the ball forward on any of them. And in some part because our legislative branch appears to be broken, and in some part because moneyed interests have a very, very big stake in our political process. And do you think that it will just get better, or there needs to be some kind of disruptive event to change the way we govern?
Oh, I think it's going to get worse unless there's a disruptive event. I mean, when you have things like the Citizens United and those court decisions are giving more power to money, and so unless there is what you call a disruptive event, I don't see any force pulling us back. And I say the one hopeful note are some issues, but a lot of them, some issues can be addressed at the local level, minimum wage. But you can't address the issue, for instance, of one of the mysteries. Why should people at the top pay lower tax rates than people who are not at the top? It's not a question of saying we're going to have a progressive tax that's going to take more from you. This is just saying you ought to pay at least the same rate. And so I think it's a really peculiar provision of our tax system.
Peculiar being euphemistic. Tomas, I want to ask you, we to the notion that economics is a social science. We see a world in upheaval, not just economically, but socially, politically, and culturally. And we've been talking a lot in the news media about terrorism and the rise of ISIS, the rise of radicalized terrorists. And there are a number of factors that folks tend to point out as motivating factors in terms of radicalizing young men. Some of those factors are economic, that they feel disenfranchised, they're at the bottom, they feel hopeless. You have no sort of accuracy meter as far as whether that is actually the force. But when you hear about something like ISIS, or in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, and radical fundamental ideologies attracting those sort of at the bottom of society, how do you process that?
Well, it's clear that there are many different, cultural and social, economic forces that are playing a role. In the Middle East, is probably the most unequal region in the world, even more unequal than Latin America, because if you take the distribution of oil resources, and in my book at some point I compare the total budget for education in a country like Egypt, which is a country with 90 million inhabitants, almost 100 million inhabitants, and their total education budget is 100 times smaller than the oil revenue that little countries with no inhabitant in the Gulf regions are getting out of their oil revenue just a few hundred kilometers away. And so that's a very unequal region, and the role that Western countries, European countries, and the US, of course, have had to protect this extremely unequal situation, I think has not helped a lot, to put it this way. I think we have contributed in a way to make this place, very place with a lot of tension. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but that's certainly part of the problem. And in the case of Charlie Hebdo, the two young brothers, well, they were 30-year-old when they went to Charlie Hebdo and killed everyone. When they were 20-year-old, 10 years ago, they wanted, and they actually tried to go to Iraq in order to fight the American army. And they could not get there, but they tried. And now, 10 years later, they are still trying to make war, but in Paris and not in Iraq. And it's So that's part of the of the story. I think the rise of nationalism and ethnic division is often a response to the failure to solve domestic social and inequality problems. And I'm very concerned also in Europe with the rise of nationalism, the rise of populism. In my country, there is a serious risk that the extreme right will win not the national election, but possibly some regional elections at the end of this year. So, I think when you cannot solve domestic social inequality problem in a peaceful manner, it's always tempting to blame others, to blame foreign workers, to blame foreign countries, foreign culture, foreign religion. And that's to me, that's the biggest danger with rising inequality, is that there can be more and more social groups who prefer to turn for nationalist solution or radical solution.
So, Professor Krugman, I would ask you, in terms of the nationalism in the United States, right? That perhaps that's rooted in institutional failure or an inability for that the system is not working for a group of people. What's weird to me is the people that are most, this sort of entrenched opposition to government programs. Many of those people are the very same beneficiaries. Or the hatred for the Affordable Care Act. There are plenty of people in red states who would benefit greatly by expanded exchanges.
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion in the sociological, political science literature. Boy, I'm sounding like a professor, aren't I? Anyway, the questions of false consciousness, and clearly in the U.S., a lot of it goes back to the original sin. It really is about race, and people don't, and it's not clear that the public in these states actually understands that they may themselves actually, it may not be taking from them to give to those people, but it might actually be for them. Actually, it's what's interesting about the case before the Supreme Court right now, the ludicrous but possibly successful attempt to use a deliberate misreading of the act to deny the subsidies. The people who will be hurt would be overwhelmingly older Southern whites, because the minority groups are in by and large being covered by Medicaid, and of course in the northern states we have state exchanges for the most part. So this is the conservative base directing, carefully aiming a gun right at its own forehead.
With people trying to pull the trigger desperately.
So but let me just say that there's a lot of people's motives are complicated, and and we may dislike them, and you might say, "Oh, look, that's stupid." But all right, people have complicated. Pride, sense of identity matters a lot. I mean, some of the political scientists I talk to point out that there's a remarkable phenomenon of affluent people in the Northeast who vote for higher taxes on themselves. And they suggest, there's a famous Thomas Frank.
There are people in this room that probably do that.
There's a. I think my forthcoming job at CUNY is going to be largely about having dinner with us. Anyway, but someone said that Thomas Frank had a great, wonderfully written book called "What's the Matter with Kansas," and saying that you probably should also have a book "What's the Matter with Connecticut," because of all of these affluent people who vote for higher taxes on themselves. But look, I think a lot of it really is identity politics. That's what you really come down to. And I picked up a phrase from when the Bernie Madoff scandal came. I learned a very useful phrase, which is affinity fraud, which is that people are very easily conned by other people who they think of as being like themselves, as being part of their tribe. And affinity fraud is just rampant in American politics.
Affinity fraud.
Yeah.
I hope everyone's writing that down and going to tweet it and use it. That's a powerful concept.
Yeah. What I want to say is there are some aspects of inequality that are particularly enervating, destructive, and lead to say socially adverse behavior. One of them is when you have high levels of unemployment, particularly of youth, particularly of males, because if they can't use their energies productively, they tend to use them unproductively. And so the kinds of problems you're seeing in Europe, where in Greece there's a 60% youth unemployment rate, that's the kind of thing where it would not be a surprise that you get explosive kinds of behavior. The second one is that there are a number of studies that show that when there is inequality that is ethnic-based, when you have large groups of people who are poor of a particular group, so it's not across the board, it has an ethnic dimension, a racial dimension, that tends to be particularly destructive. And at least, you know, looking across countries, those countries where you have that kind of division are more likely to find themselves engaged in civil strife or one kind of dysfunctional behavior or another.
So that sort of gives rise to a bigger question here, which is, do you think more equal societies are happier societies? Because there are divergent studies about this, right? Income inequality seems like a bad thing, but unequal societies are not maybe necessarily happier societies. I guess I would like all three of your thoughts on that. Thomas, if you want to start.
You know, it's a matter of degree. You know, if you have a complete equality in poverty, you will not be very happy. So you probably need, you know, you need. So you know, China 30 years ago or 35 years ago was probably quite equal, but equal with you know, a lot of poverty that was not particularly good. So some level of inequality, you know, can be necessary to put incentives on people, so that's which sometimes just correspond to different life choices, sometimes correspond to pure incentives. So some level of inequality can be justified. Now the problem is that very often we use this kind of argument to justify inequality levels which can absolutely not be justified like this, and which are bad for growth and which are bad for social welfare and happiness. And you know, I think the level of inequality in the US right now is very difficult to justify on the basis of you know, incentives or growth consideration and it is the same actually probably in China now, where now you know, at 30 years ago they didn't want to become like the Soviet Union, so they liberalized their economy, which was probably a very smart decision. But now they should be afraid, you know, not to become like post-Soviet Russia with oligarchs taking the money and going to other countries and living off dividends out of their country and so you know, there's some level of inequality that can be tolerated. There's a lot of evidence that you can become very rich and very happy with moderate inequality, like in Northern Europe, you know, in Sweden, Sweden or Norway or Denmark, you know, you have moderate inequality.
But you still need sunlight, which is why they're screwed.
No, they're rich enough to afford to fly to
right. Turks and Caicos.
Yeah.
No, there are still things missing over there, but it's you know, there is evidence that we don't need extreme inequality.
And I guess I would also focus, not, you know, you talk about happiness and the average happiness. I'd worry a little bit much more on what you might call the deprivation. The people at the bottom are not happy when you have a lot of inequality, you know, and they're not able to make the ends meet. And justifiably unhappy, justifiably we should be concerned. So to me, those kinds of extremes of inequality really are bad for society and very bad for the people.
I'm going to give something subjective here. I think that at least what strikes me, I mean, the raw deprivation that's so common in the United States is the main thing. But there's also something that the rat race nature of what we've created, which is intimately tied in with inequality. That you talk to young people, and they all of the ones I know seem to have this sense that they've almost like they've just joined the Marines, and it's like the look to the man to your left, look to the man to your right. Only one of you three is going to make it through.
Yeah.
That's the way life is for a 20-something American now, and that is closely tied to the sense that we have extreme inequality, and if you don't make it into those upper tiers, you have you won't have health care. I mean, you won't have even the essentials of life. It's
sort of like the rungs of the ladder are much further apart, and if you fall down, you really fall a long way. And this is not just a question of, you know, you might say perceived happiness, what you did in a survey. One of the remarkable things about the United States is that our life expectancy is lower than in other countries of comparable income, and our overall health. And part of the explanation is that we don't have good health insurance. But the interesting thing is, it turns out that even among people with just as good health insurance, with just as good income, the health is not as good. Life expectancy is not as good as in the United States. And one of the hypotheses about that is life is very stressful, and stress is not good.
Tell me about it. I'm up here on stage with you guys. Life is stressful.
Yeah.
I do want to ask specifically, Paul, in terms of some of the narrative that's out there. Hillary Clinton may be running for president. Patricia Arquette has been talking about wage equality, gender equality, the importance of it. I think that there was a study that fewer large companies are run by women than by men named John or men named David.
Right.
Which to me tells me there are not a lot of large companies run by women. And I guess I wonder from an economics point of view, obviously we want to say we have gender parity in terms of wages, right? That's like a good thing for us to say. But in terms of, talk to me about that in economic terms. How important is that?
Well, it's a huge waste of potential. Presumably, there are, as the same fraction of women have the talents to actually run a company well as men. And so by excluding, I actually have a vague sense that if you wanted to invest in companies, you want to choose companies where the CEOs don't look the part. If there's a tall, silver-haired guy with
patrician face,
and then he probably got there on his looks, and he probably is an idiot. And in a certain sense, the fact that the guy is male, that's a guy, is telling you that they probably have somewhat excluded people because they just are the wrong gender. And no, this is I think we are a more equal society in that respect than we used to be, and obviously we've benefited from that enormously, and we've stopped a long ways short of it. It's a remarkable thing. And it also gets back to Joe's point about markets aren't all that, right? Because you will find economists who say, well, if women were really just as good as men, then they'd be paid the same wages and they'd be offered the same opportunities, because the invisible hand of the marketplace, and no, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, in BLS is 13 industry categories, Joe. Women make less than men in every single one. Men have been entering traditionally female-dominated sectors during the recovery period and earn more than women even in female-dominated jobs.
Yeah. I think the point that Paul just made is, I think, really a key point. And it's related to the point we were talking about before about Walmart being able to raise its wage without any real consequence. The point is that it's not just abstract market forces. There are social forces going on. There are market power, exploitation, discrimination. And that's where, the fact that that's the case has one hopeful element to it, that if we adopted policies, we could change that. It's not going to happen on its own. Those kinds of things have been perpetuated for a very long time, but it's actually the case that if we eliminated that kind of discrimination, we would actually have a better performing economy. So we could have more equality and a better performing economy.
It's been hard to get that message through. I know we have questions from the audience coming at some point, but before we get to them, I want to sort of ask you guys, and there are some of the questions. We've spent a long time talking about the things that are wrong in the world, and I would like to know from each one of you where you see the bright spots. Where is the good news? Thomas, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm not particularly pessimistic. I see lots of good news. If you take a very long-run perspective, we are talking about the problem of Europe today, but Europe is a much more prosperous and also a much more equal place today than what it was a century ago, when Europe was extremely unequal, more unequal than the US. And today, US is much more unequal than Europe. So, things change, and different choices of policies and institutions can make things change. And also in the emerging world, there are lots of positive evolution going on. I believe in that globalization can help to reduce poverty in the world. assuming we don't expect everything from the market and we adopt the policies that can make globalization benefit to broader groups of the population. And sometimes government do it. You know, in Brazil, during the past 15 years, there were policies that were adopted, including increasing the minimum wage, investment in public education, which allowed for a reduction of inequality together with quite high growth. You know, they start from a level of inequality which is extremely high in Brazil historically. This is a country where, you know, 1/3 of the population was in slavery 120 years ago. So, you know, there's a, you know, each country has its own complicated history with inequality, but there are, yes, there are bright spots. You know, poverty in China was much higher 30 years ago than it is today. So, yeah, I'm not, you know, I think it's not, our job is not to say that things are always worse and that inequality is always rising. You know, this is not the way I view my job. You know, I think there are lots of opportunities which are sometimes taken by government and sometimes, you know, not taken so much as they should.
Okay, well, I guess there are three things I mentioned very briefly. One, Thomas just mentioned, which is not just Brazil, but several countries in Latin America have been experiencing a reduction in inequality. And that's partly because inequality in those countries had grown to such a high level that they couldn't continue to ignore it. They put in place policies that actually were directed at reducing inequality, and they worked. So that's, you know, it shows that when there's a political will, you can actually make significant progress in a relatively short time. The second one is sort of looking at it from a global point of view. What happened from 1820 to, say, 1980 was that large parts of the world fell way behind. India and China, that have close to 50% of the population, used to have close to 50% of the global GDP, and it went down to 8%. And now, the income of those countries are going up. 500 million people moved out of poverty in China. There have been an enormous number of people who've really benefited, seen their incomes grow in the last 50 years, just not in America.
But elsewhere.
And the third point is the fact that we're having this discussion here today, that the issue of inequality has finally been raised to the point where even some of the Republican candidates are talking about it. Maybe they want to increase it, I'm not sure, but at least they're talking about it.
Yeah.
Poverty warrior has a different meaning, perhaps, in some circles.
So I'm actually, so I'm moving from Princeton to CUNY Grad Center, and particularly with the Luxembourg Income Study Group, who study income inequality, and they've been doing it for decades, but have seen a tremendous upsurge in interest. I mean, it has become, so these are people who have a, you know, their finger on the pulse, and the issue of inequality really has come to the fore, which is hopeful. That's how you start to finally build a consensus to do something about it. I also want to actually, just coming back to the issue of gender inequality and such things. While it's still terrible and enormous gaps and inequality of treatment, in many ways, let me put it this way, if you go back to when America was truly a middle-class society in the 60s, we lost a lot of good things when that went away. On the other hand, there was a lot of raw racism, raw sexism, raw prejudice that is, and we have become in many ways a vastly more tolerant, accepting society. You watch something like, I've studied some of these polls. When Reagan was elected, a plurality of Americans were opposed to interracial marriage.
Yeah.
That we've changed a lot in those times. And think about how, you know, in the 2004 election, to some extent, was decided on the issue of gay marriage. As I say, you know, Bush ran as America's defender against gay married terrorists. And then, and here we are just, you know, 11 years later, and all of a sudden that's become a widely accepted things. So that doesn't excuse this spectacular inequality, the growth of plutocracy, the oligarchy. What I think Thomas has successfully convinced me is a high likelihood that it becomes increasingly a hereditary elite. But it does say that there are good things as well. And I think those things continue. And maybe, eventually, we finally do tackle the problem of income inequality as well.
We just need Will and Grace to take on income inequality.
Well,
I'm kidding.
yes.
That's off the air.
Thanks.
Okay. So questions from the audience. This is from Sonia Forgo. I'll start with you, Paul. What are the policy changes you would like to see in the next 5 years to best address income inequality?
Okay.
This is like the
That
wish
I'd like
list.
to see, or that I think have a chance of
What
actually happening.
like to see? You'd like to
Right.
see
No.
pie in the sky, or as realistic as you want?
No, well, I mean, we actually have a pretty good idea of a menu of stuff that would make a big difference, and some of it is aftermarket, is higher taxes, higher taxes on particularly on capital income, we can go after some of those international tax havens, and more aid. Of course, get the Affordable Care Act actually working nationwide, but more aid, especially for children. Some of it is pre-market, and here's what we've just seen. The Walmart example I find tremendously encouraging. It's saying that it doesn't take very much to push large private sector employers who are paying criminally low wages into paying a lot more. And so all it would take would be raise the minimum wage, make the legal policy balance has been shifted so overwhelmingly against unionization that actually just moving it back somewhere towards neutral, I think, would make a big difference. Would that, we don't know how much all that would do, but I don't think it's actually very hard to think of a set of pretty simple policies, everything from minimum wages, card check, more progressive taxation, more aid that would, these are all things that I think in the euphoria after the 2008 election, many of us thought might be about to happen, and maybe now it doesn't happen until Chelsea's second term, or but it's not hard. I think that one of the things we're learning is it's actually technically not that hard to do a lot about inequality.
Yeah, well, the last chapter of my book, The Price of Inequality, actually is devoted to this. So if you want the whole list, you should buy the book.
Just a couple.
Right.
Just a couple.
But I think the big distinction I would make is between there are a number of policies that sort of tweak at the edge or are important but don't address the underlying structure. So, and then there are real policies that try to get at not just the symptoms, and a symptom is like the wage being very low at the bottom. That's a symptom, but looking at what are the forces giving rise to this. So, for instance, what Paul just mentioned, stronger unions would make a difference in terms of changing the bargaining power. Laws that did something about, part of our tax law almost encouraged CEO bonuses, stock options. And if we just got rid of that, got more transparency on that, I think that would probably, say in pay, that you would think that people who work for you, you ought to have a say in their pay.
Yeah.
But the shareholders have no say in the pay of the people who are supposed to work for them. Those are kinds of changes that might bring down the top. And then finally, not finally, but a really important part is obviously education.
Yeah.
Because we have a whole set of ways where we give transmission of advantage from one generation to another, and that's gotten worse. We spend more in our public education on the children of the rich than we do on the children of the poor. So there are lots of things like that if we're going to do something about inequality, we have to break that transmission mechanism, which is making it hard for those at the bottom to make it up.
Thomas?
Right. Now, investment in public education, I think there's a very strong theoretical discourse about meritocracy, equal opportunity, which is just the gap with what's happening in the real life in this country is quite large. There's also a big gap in other countries, but in this country, there's a graph that Raj Shetty and Emmanuel Saez recently produced, where if you put the percentile rank in the family income distribution and the probability to access higher education, you go almost from 0 to 100. So if you are in the bottom 20% or bottom half of the family distribution of income, at the bottom you have only a 20% chance to access higher education. If you have in the top 10%, you have almost a 90%, 100% chance to access higher education. And you have a straight line basically going from 0 to 100 if you take the percentile rank in family income and access to higher education. And if you take for very top schools, very top universities, the average income from the data we have, but there's actually too little transparency about that. The average income of the parents of Harvard undergrad right now corresponds to the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution of family income. So that doesn't mean that nobody from below the top 2 gets to Harvard, but this means something very precise, which is that the people from below the top 2% that go to Harvard are sufficiently few,
right,
and the people from the top 2 are sufficiently high up in the top 2 that the overall average is as if all students had been picked at random within the top 2% of the distribution. So you see the gap between this and the official discourse in terms of the very high mobility of American society and meritocratic feature, it's quite large.
Well,
and so I think investing in public education and a more equal access to education, and this should be financed, of course, by making the top groups pay more tax.
Let me just emphasize why that's so important. One of the reasons it's so important. I described before how the median income has been stagnating. Median income of, say, full-time male worker is below what it was 40 years ago. If you divide that into those who get a college education and those who don't, those who have only a high school, their incomes have really plummeted. So it's not just stagnating, they're really plummeting. So those people at the bottom that Thomas described, the children have very little chance of getting college. That means their income prospects are really bad.
Well, I actually let me just say, I'm a little concerned about where we're going here, because all this is true, but education is not by itself remotely a solution. In fact, incomes of college grads have been flat for 15 years in the United States. It's no longer the case that this is about college grads versus not. At this point, basically, high school teachers and hedge fund managers have similar levels of education, but not similar destinies in recent years. And so we need to understand that this is not. I think
it won't be fixed by education.
In many ways, education is more about, I would say at this point, it's more about everyone having access to the opportunities. It's not clear how much the inequality of outcomes would be changed. It's more about access to opportunities.
I think you're right in the very top part of the distribution, where it's not education. It's not. It's not the top 1% income earners. They are not a lot more educated than the next 2 or 3 or 5%, as you were saying. So it's more, top managerial compensation that has exploded, the financial sector that has taken. So I agree with you that education is not going to solve this top part of inequality. But if you think of the bottom part, the bottom 50% of the US workforce as compared to the next 40%, the next 10%, then I think the inequality in access to skills and education is a serious issue.
Well, it's certainly a factor reducing social mobility. And what I was going to break in is we actually have some evidence that where students who took standardized tests in 8th grade have been tracked further, and we can compare their students' likelihood of completing college based upon their test scores and based upon the socioeconomic status of their families. And rich, dumb kids are more likely to graduate from college than,
Right.
than smart,
Well,
poor kids. That's
So,
America
but
today.
this is the thing. I mean, whether it's education or whether it's fiscal policy, whether it's redistribution, that it comes from a policy-making class that is going to fundamentally change this, right? And the policy-making class tends to be the better educated and wealthier class. So I guess, you know, when you look at changing these systems, whichever system you want, I mean, how do you get the change agents in the systems? And I wonder, and Paul, I'll start with you. How much credence do you, I mean, how much import do you put on grassroots movements, like Occupy, for example, to change systems?
Well, I think
That's actually a question
Yeah.
from the audience that I paraphrased wildly.
No, I think they can matter a lot, and they can matter by not in itself. I mean, it was never going to be the case that people were going to move up from Zuccotti Park and storm the bastions of Wall Street, but it actually did change the discussion, and in a way, it has not flipped back. The issues that were raised by Occupy have not gone out of the discussion. I think it takes a mix of things. I mean, part of, I'm being forced into being the optimist and idealist here, but
It's a bleak crowd.
but that, well, it's true that you know that highly educated, privileged people have disproportionate political power in our system. They aren't all completely selfish.
Right.
And people, there are, I think, enough, so we don't rely solely upon the goodwill of enlightened people who've had privilege, but there will be some of those, and there can be popular movements, and there can be agitators who bring issues to the fore. And I think if you tried to look at the balance of forces in America in the 1920s, you would have said, you know, no way this can possibly be reformed, and yet it was. And why, you know, it can happen again. It doesn't have to. Could be that we remain stuck for a very long time, but hopefully not.
Thomas, in terms of Occupy, which is a global movement, not beyond Zuccotti Park, perhaps not as well covered in the American media, but how much stock do you put in the grassroots movements?
No, I think this can play and this must play a very important role. Now, you know, Occupy Wall Street happened mostly in Wall Street rather than in Brussels or in Paris or in Tokyo. Well, Hong Kong, it's really a different movement. Here, it's a movement about, you know, political freedom and political democracy in the Chinese context, and that's very, very important. But I mean, if Occupy Wall Street happened more in Wall Street than in Brussels or Paris or Berlin or Tokyo, it's because the rise of the 1%, you know, has been a lot stronger in Wall Street and in the US than in Europe or in Japan. So you know, there are reasons for this, and in a way, it's at least it's reassuring to see that there is some, you know, some awareness of that. You know, I think the democratization of knowledge and the diffusion of economic knowledge can play an important role, you know, I think. But then, you know, it's, you know, we need more and more citizens to, you know, to be involved, to be informed. You know, I think the success of books on inequality, such as those written by Joe, Paul, or my own book, you know, shows that there is certainly a strong demand for, you know, economic knowledge, and you know, many people, not only in the US, but in many other parts of the world, are tired to hear that this is too complicated for them, that they cannot understand economic issues, that, you know, there's only one solution, only one policy, and many people are asking for more than that, and, you know, I think this can, in the long run, make a difference.
Let me come back to the question of the role of civil society. And one, you know, I was very pessimistic about Europe, but one hopeful sign in Europe is the growth of these of new groups like Palermo's in Spain, which are saying the old parties are not really addressing the problems of unemployment, inequality, and right now it's the leading party in Spain with about 27%. But I think that also raises an important point. I think in the end, it's going to have to be political action that's going to address these issues. And civil society can bring the issue to the fore, but the real challenge will be to try to get those ideas into the political process. And in the United States, I'm not so optimistic. In Europe, it's partly because of the really collapse of the real failure of the old parties. We haven't yet gotten to that stage.
Yeah, I noticed the yet in that sentence. Okay, I'll go to you, Tomas, first on this. With the current status quo, socioeconomically speaking, where do you see the future of the wealthy nations in the Gulf, such as Saudi Arabia?
Where do I see the future?
Where do you see the future of the wealthy nations in the Gulf, such as Saudi
heavens.
Arabia?
Well, I don't know. I think the frontiers in this part of the world, are largely arbitrary, and they were drawn at some point in time, and it looks as if some of them will be redrawn. I mean, but I don't know how. It's so that's I don't know if that's part of the question, but I think the inequality of resources in this part of the world is just impossible to justify. There are countries with very large population, with very little resources, and countries with very small population, with lots of resources. They don't know what to do with it, I prefer peaceful redistribution, but sometimes redistribution takes other forms.
Indeed. Paul, what is your opinion of disruptive digital currencies such as Bitcoin? Do they in any way refute the idea that a currency must be backed by a government?
Okay. There was, actually at this point, Bitcoin is not looking too good. Money is a pretty amazing thing, right? For the most part, why does a piece of green paper with a dead president have value? And it's because other people think it has value and it circulates. And however, there is an anchor for our dollar bills, which is not gold. It is the fact that you can use to pay taxes. And then you have somebody try and create Bitcoin, which is there's nothing in the end. It's supposed to be purely self-fulfilling prophecy, purely levitating on itself, which is not impossible, but it's kind of unlikely. And I have to say, I think a lot of what has happened, Bitcoin looks like it really is a bubble in multiple senses. It's a little bit of, apparently it's a technically sweet solution to a problem, but it's not clear that problem is one that has much economic relevance. Certainly not a reason to hold that currency. There's a lot of libertarian ideology about it, and I think some people were looking for something, and they bought into it, and literally bought into it for a while, but it's collapsed quite a way. So no, the idea that there's something fundamental. I mean, if you're looking for the idea that a currency doesn't really have to be something physical, it can be something that's virtual, that's the system we already have. And if you want it to be, I want a way to make payments electronically, that's, credit cards. I mean, so exactly what it is that this thing is supposed to be doing that we don't already mostly do. I mean, there are technical differences, but pretty wild. I mean, we already have an amazingly abstract, sorry, I'm going on too much, but the monetary base. We have $4 trillion now in monetary base, and it consists of nothing but ones and zeros. I mean, so what it's the idea that now, I've got this brilliant new thing. It's going to be digital.
The internet.
We're already there. Yeah.
Professor Stiglitz, economically speaking, what should the U.S. or Europe do vis-a-vis China to ensure growth for all?
Well, in terms of China, it's been doing actually quite well on its own. It's been growing, for 30 years after they began the transition to a market economy. They grew at an average rate of 10%. It wasn't fully shared prosperity. The Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, when they began, was very low. And they achieved in 30 years the level of inequality that it took us a long time to. So they now, their Gini coefficient now is comparable to the United States. But at the same time, they moved, as I mentioned before, 500 million people out of poverty. You know, it was the most successful anti-poverty program. They're likely to grow more slowly, and but even if they're growing at 7 or even 6%, that's higher than economists even really thought was possible 40 years ago. 40 years ago would be a 5% would be a phenomenal rate. So I think China is doing quite well. The real problem is the United States and Europe.
Yeah.
And for Europe, my view, Europe has very talented people, as we've seen. But I mean, it actually has a lot of good institutions, all the things that you would have thought would have made for strong growth, except for two things. The euro was a mistake, and the institutions around that would make it work, and a set of policies and the ideas that we talked about in the beginning that really have been strangling the euro. So for me, for Europe to start to grow, it has nothing to do with China. For Europe to start to grow is really for it to fix the problem of the euro, and to solve the problem of the austerity fanatics in Germany, particularly. So and for the United States, I don't think it's the issue of China that is really the key issue. The case for the issues in the United States are really what the kinds of issues that we've been talking about today. The issues of how do we stimulate our economy more, invest more, and make sure that the growth that we have is more equally shared. And I think that will be a virtuous cycle, so that if we had it more equally shared, demand would be stronger, the economy would be growing.
We have to wrap it up, but we can't wrap it up without getting your thoughts on the Germans, the Europeans, and the China.
Well, and China, yeah,
Not that the Germans aren't Europeans, but you know what I'm saying. They have a special role of import in Europe right now.
I think the European institutions are even more dysfunctional than American federal institutions, which, I don't know if this is good news, but that's certainly a fact. But, I think Chinese institutions maybe are even more dysfunctional than the European institutions, in the sense that, this is a country that will have to do major reforms in terms of democracy and also transparency on economic and financial issues. This is the only country where, you have an income tax in China, but there's no income tax statistic of any sort. It's not even possible to know how much money was collected by income brackets the previous year. And I have studied many countries, and I've never seen that. They say they want to fight corruption right now, but the way they do it, which is a little bit the Russian way, they put a few people in jail.
Which is a strange way to combat corruption.
Yeah, well, yes, they put a few people in jail from time to time, which is what Putin did. So they do the same in China. But, I think it will be a lot more efficient to have a more democratic and more transparent approach to the economy and to the tax system. For instance, if they were to publish at the local level how many taxpayers by income bracket, including for very high income brackets. In many cases, we will realize that the law and the tax system is not really being applied the way it should, and it will allow, the popular groups and grassroots groups also to use this information to complain about the way the government is working, the tax system is working. So these are very serious issues that they will have to address. And if we want to, on the international arena, when we think of fighting tax havens and we think of minimal tax on large multinational corporations, we need to bring China in that game. You know, we are not going to solve this thing just between, you know, the US and the European Union. You know, China has to play a role, and, you know, the lack of transparency in the Hong Kong financial system is a serious issue. I think we have to look at all these different regions and parts of the world together if we want to solve that kind of problem.
I want to say one more thing about lack of transparency. The air in Beijing and Shanghai, China could very well be the first economy to really to strangle itself on environmental problems. So.
True. Truer words were not spoken. Well,
Sorry.
there are many true words tonight. I can say that we end this evening perhaps more optimistic, certainly more fired up. It's been wonderful and enlightening to have the conversation with three geniuses, Thomas Piketty, Joseph Stiglitz, Paul Krugman. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys.
All right. All right.